For myself personally, as somebody who prescribes to the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith, one of the challenges that I've noticed pastorally is that I too would prescribe to this kind of lowercase c baptismal Catholicity, wanting to link arms across the aisle, so to speak. That's not my all of time definitive and definite position. So if Christ chooses to tarry for 10,000 years, I wouldn't hold that in one local assembly you should have both the Paedo and Credo Baptist position represented by the eldership of the church and practiced for all of time. But I think that we're living, for lack of a better word, in a unique dispensation in this moment where we've got some pretty ferocious giants that the church is facing, some dragons that need to be slayed, most notably and urgently. I would say secular humanism being a very large one. We've seen the eroding and kind of recession of Christendom in the West, and we want to regain that. And so the idea that Presbyterians and Baptists, both being confessionals, 1689 and 1646, partnering for the next 20 or 50 years in a local assembly because they have postmillennialism in common, Kuyperianism in common, theonomy in common, patriarchy in common, these kinds of things that are absolutely vital in order to slay this present dragon of secularism, in order to reusher a Christendom 2.0, and then maybe we can start to fight about baptism again. I just feel like the debate of baptism, it matters. It certainly matters, but in some sense it feels as though it's a luxury of times of peace for the church that we currently are not living in. What do you think about that? Would you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, Joel, actually. We don't have that luxury right now. It's a luxury for times of peace. I think that the church is under tremendous pressure in the West, unprecedented really in many, many years. And I think a good example of what you're saying actually is found in on the mission field, in the traditional mission fields, I should say, of the Western Church. So when we talk about mission, we still tend not to think about our own nations, which I think we really should be as well. But we think about heathen lands historically, Islamic cultures, pagan cultures,
right.
Hindu cultures, and so on. My family were missionaries in the Islamic world for about 17 years, my parents. And in the part of the world that they were for all those years, the missionaries were from both Paedo and Credo Baptist backgrounds, Presbyterians, Anglicans, Baptists, Pentecostals. And in that setting, when you're up against the behemoth of Islam, the colossus of the Islamic world, and the percentage of Christians is hovering around 1%, your priority is not ironing out the details of which of those confessions should be adhered to, and the niceties of how one should deal with perhaps a Paedo-baptized person who wants to go and join membership in a Baptist community. Those simply aren't the priorities for obvious reasons. You've got a much larger, broader battle to fight. And so, as you say, it's not that the question of baptisms is not important, but as the book of Hebrews says, it's one of the foundations. It's the milk. It's baptisms and discussions about baptisms have gone on for centuries. And this is not an argument that we are going to solve anytime soon. In my view, I think we're going to have these two emphases with us for a very long time. And so in a missions context, it's simply not the priority. And I think that in times of great prosperity for the church in the West, in times of, in a certain sense, we might say cultural influence or even cultural victory, it wasn't just Baptists and Paedo-Baptists that would squabble. It would be Baptist denominations and Reformed denominations on even lesser issues, dividing and where I was in Toronto, there was an old story about the two Baptist movements that where some of the older people would tell me that, when they were kids, there would sometimes be some stone throwing and argy-bargy between kids from the two different Baptist communities, because one was on that side of the road and the other one was in the other neighborhood, and they belonged to two different fellowships. And it's like, so in a certain sense, that sort of thing, clobbering each other with our clogs, is a luxury for a different time. To say, well, we're all going to paddle in our own paddling pool. Right now, there are a bigger fish to fry, as you said, with the assault of secularism, of repaganization in some parts of Europe, Islam. And I think there's a good precedent for what you're saying. John Bunyan, in that time of tremendous pressure on the church in England, pressure on nonconformists. Bunyan spent a lot of time in prison, as you know. Bunyan was a non-sectarian on the baptism issue. And actually, some of the great Puritan leaders like Oliver Cromwell had that Catholicity that you were talking about on this issue. So I do think one major factor to consider is, what is the cultural environment? What's the cultural situation? Is that discussion, the intramural debate between Reformed, evangelical, faithful, Christ-honoring believers, is that the priority? And is it something we should be splitting up, dividing over, avoiding co-belligerence, not welcoming each other to the Lord's table and so on, or welcoming one another into membership? No, I don't think so. I think we're at a moment, as you say, even if we talk about from a pragmatic point of view, there's one faith, there's one baptism. And right now, there are much bigger challenges that I think if the church got our mind into those, let's come back to this one. But it's not the highest priority.
Yes, I completely agree. And I like what you shared in terms of the foreign mission field, especially in Islamic countries and cultures that that's a perfect example of those who do not have the luxury to debate this particular issue. And I think in the West, we need to come to those similar terms and recognizing that secularism is quickly becoming a comparable threat to what Islam is in other countries. That as we look at the West, if we're to analyze things properly and honestly, and we run through the statistics, we run through the numbers, and if we actually don't include in those numbers false churches, prosperity gospel preaching, heretical churches, and we actually just look at true churches within the bounds of orthodoxy in the West, with the rise of the nuns, those who would prescribe to no religious affiliation, I think that the West is quickly becoming comparable to the East and other places that have, whether a pagan culture or is Islamic culture. And so if we think of secularism in those terms, and we think that the West is no longer in its heyday of Christendom, certainly there are many still remnants of Christendom that we often take for granted, but we're no longer in the heyday of Christendom. And Christendom is eroding, foundations are being destroyed, secularism is a formidable enemy, quickly becoming comparable to Islam, for example, then I think we need to think, we need to employ wartime strategies and not peacetime strategies. And in wartime strategies, should be an extra willingness to form alliances, right? That Americans may not be particularly fond of the French, but if Great Britain is on our doorstep, then all of a sudden an American-French alliance, it may make sense, even if we perhaps regret it at a later point. And so I think that we're in that kind of moment. One quick question on that end. I have the sense that secularism, that things are going to get worse before they get better in the short run with secularism in the West. In the long run, though, if Christ does tarry for 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years, who knows the day or the hour, but if that is a possibility. I have the sense that that secularism, although a formidable enemy and a dragon of significant size, that it's going to get a little bit stronger, but quickly I think will be slain. I think that there's a sense in which there's worse things yet to come, but also if we think in the next 50 years, but if we think in the next 500 years, I think 500 years from now, our great-great-great-grandchildren will go on field trips to museums and look at Jackson Pollock paintings, and the teacher will inspire the children to collectively laugh at the absurdity of what we once thought was beautiful and the fruit of secularism. So I think 50 years of secularism, I'm not particularly encouraged for my children and grandchildren's sake. 500 years of secularism, thinking of my great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, I think that they will be laughing at the corpse of this dragon that's been sufficiently slain. Back to Islam, if I was to write a fictional book, a fantasy of post-millennial, progressive, gradual conquering of Christ through the church in the earth, and the progression of Christendom, I have a sense, and I'm curious if you feel the same, Dr. Boot, that I think Islam may be one of the last dragons to be slain. What do you think?